While still on the stairs in the entrance passage, he heard an extraordinary hubbub. The noise seemed to proceed from Spallanzani's study. There was a stamping, a rattling, pushing, knocking against the door, with curses and oaths intermingled. Leave hold, you monster, you rascal, staked your life and honor upon it. That was not our wager, I made the eyes, I the clockwork. Go to the devil with your clockwork, you damned dog of a watchmaker. Be off, Satan. Stop, you paltry turner, you infernal beast. Stop. Be gone. Let me go. The voices which were thus making all this racket and rumpus were those of Spallanzani and the fearsome Coppelius. Nathaniel rushed in, impelled by some nameless dread. The professor was grasping a female figure by the shoulders. The Italian Coppola held her by the feet, and they were pulling and dragging each other backwards and forwards, fighting furiously to get possession of her. Nathaniel recoiled with horror on recognizing that the figure was Olympia. Boiling with rage, he was about to tear his beloved from the grasp of the madman when Coppola, by an extraordinary exertion of strength, twisted the figure out of the professor's hands and gave him such a terrible blow with her that he reeled backwards and fell over the table, all amongst the phials and retorts, the bottles and glass cylinders which covered it. All these things were smashed into 1,000 pieces. But Coppola threw the figure across his shoulder and, laughing shrilly and horribly, ran hastily down the stairs, the figure's ugly feet hanging down and banging and rattling like wood against the steps. Nathaniel was stupefied. He had seen only too distinctly that in Olympia's pallid waxed face there were no eyes, merely black holes in their stead. She was an inanimate puppet. Spallanzani was rolling on the floor. The pieces of glass had cut his head and breast and arm. The blood was escaping from him in streams, but he gathered his strength together by an effort. After him! What do you stand staring there for? Coppelius, he's stolen my best automaton, at which I've worked for 20 years, staked my life upon it. The clockwork, speech movement, mine, your eyes stolen. Your eyes, damn him, curse him, after him. Fetch me back Olympia, there are the eyes. And now Nathaniel saw a pair of bloody eyes lying on the floor, staring at him. Spallanzani seized them with his uninjured hand and threw them at him, so that they hit his breast. Then madness dug her burning talons into him and swept down into his heart, rending his mind and thoughts to shreds. Aha! Firewheel! Spin round, firewheel, merrily. Aha, wooden doll! Spin round, pretty wooden doll. And he threw himself upon the professor, clutching him fast by the throat. He would certainly have strangled him had not several people, attracted by the noise, rushed in and torn away the madman. And so they saved the professor, whose wounds were immediately dressed. Sigmund, with all his strength, was not able to subdue the frantic lunatic, who continued to scream in a dreadful way, spin round, wooden doll, and to strike out right and left with his double fists. At length, the united strength of several succeeded in overpowering him by throwing him on the floor and binding him. His cries passed into a brutish bellow that was awful to hear, and thus raging with the harrowing violence of madness, he was taken away to the madhouse. Before continuing my narration of what happened further to the unfortunate Nathaniel, I will tell you, indulgent reader, in case you take any interest in that skillful mechanician and fabricator of automata, Spallanzani, that he recovered completely from his wounds. He had, however, to leave the university, for Nathaniel's fate had created a great sensation, and the opinion was pretty generally expressed that it was an imposture altogether unpardonable to have smuggled a wooden puppet instead of a living person to intelligent tea circles, for Olympia had been present at several with success. Lawyers called it a cunning piece of knavery, and all the harder to punish since it was directed against the public, and it had been so craftily contrived that it had escaped unobserved by all except a few preternaturally acute students, although everybody was very wise now and remembered to have thought of several facts which occurred to them as suspicious. But these latter could not succeed in making out any sort of a consistent tale. For was it, for instance, a thing likely to occur to anyone as suspicious that, according to the declaration of an elegant beau of these tea parties, Olympia had, contrary to all good manners, sneezed oftener than she had yawned? The former must have been, in the opinion of this elegant gentleman, the winding up of the concealed clockwork. It had always been accompanied by an observable creaking, and so on. The professor of poetry and eloquence took a pinch of snuff, and slapping the lid to and clearing his throat, said solemnly, "My most honourable ladies and gentlemen, don't you see, then, where the rub is? The whole thing is an allegory, a continuous metaphor. You understand me? Sapienti sate." But several most honourable gentlemen did not rest satisfied with this explanation. The history of this automaton had sunk deeply into their souls, and an absurd mistrust of human figures began to prevail. Several lovers, in order to be fully convinced that they were not paying court to a wooden puppet, required that their mistress should sing and dance a little out of time, should embroider or knit or play with her little pug when being read to, but above all things else that she should do something more than merely listen, that she should frequently speak in such a way as to really show that her words presupposed as a condition some thinking and feeling. The bonds of love were in many cases drawn closer in consequence, and so of course became more engaging. In other instances they gradually relaxed and fell away. "I cannot really be made responsible for it," was the remark of more than one young gallant. At the tea gatherings everybody, in order to ward off suspicion, yawned to an incredible extent and never sneezed. Spallanzani was obliged, as has been said, to leave the place in order to escape a criminal charge of having fraudulently imposed an automaton upon human society. Coppola, too, had also disappeared. When Nathaniel awoke, he felt as if he had been oppressed by a terrible nightmare. He opened his eyes and experienced an indescribable sensation of mental comfort, whilst a soft and most beautiful sensation of warmth pervaded his body. He lay on his own bed, in his own room at home. Clara was bending over him, and at a little distance stood his mother and Lothair. At last, oh my darling Nathaniel, now we have you again. Now you are cured of your grievous illness. Now you are mine again. And Clara's words came from the depths of her heart, and she clasped him in her arms. The bright scalding tears streamed from his eyes. He was so overcome with mingled feelings of sorrow and delight, and he gasped forth, "My Clara, my Clara." Siegmund, who had staunchly stood by his friend in his hour of need, now came into the room. Nathaniel gave him his hand. "My faithful brother, you have not deserted me." Every trace of insanity had left him, and in the tender hands of his mother and his beloved and his friends, he quickly recovered his strength again. Good fortune had in the meantime visited the house. A niggardly old uncle, from whom they had never expected to get anything, had died, and left Nathaniel's mother not only a considerable fortune, but also a small estate, pleasantly situated not far from the town. There they resolved to go and live, Nathaniel and his mother and Clara, to whom he was now to be married, and Lothair. Nathaniel was becoming gentler and more childlike than he had ever been before, and now began really to understand Clara's supremely pure and noble character. None of them ever reminded him, even in the remotest degree, of the past. But when Siegmund took leave of him, he said, By heaven, brother, I was in a bad way. But an angel came just at the right moment and led me back upon the path of light. Yes, it was Clara. Sigmund would not let him speak further, fearing lest the painful recollections of the past might arise too vividly and too intensely in his mind. The time came for the 4 happy people to move to their little property. At noon they were going through the streets. After making several purchases, they found that the lofty tower of the townhouse was throwing its giant shadows across the marketplace. "Come," said Clara, "let us go up to the top once more and have a look at the distant hills." No sooner said than done. Both of them, Nathaniel and Clara, went up to the tower. Their mother, however, went on with the servant girl to their new home, and Lothair, not feeling inclined to climb up all the many steps, waited below. There the two lovers stood arm in arm on the topmost gallery of the tower and gazed out into the sweet-scented wooded landscape, beyond which the blue hills rose up like a giant city. "Oh, do look at the strange little grey bush. It looks as if it were actually walking towards us," said Clara. Mechanically, he put his hand into his side pocket. He found Coppola's perspective and looked for the bush. Clara stood in front of the glass. Then a convulsive thrill shot through his pulse and veins. Pale as a corpse, he fixed his staring eyes upon her. But soon they began to roll, and a fiery current flashed and sparkled in them, and he yelled fearfully like a haunted animal. Leaping up high in the air and laughing horribly at the same time, he began to shout in a piercing voice, "Spin round, wooden doll! Spin round, wooden doll!" With the strength of a giant, he laid hold upon Clara and tried to hurl her over, but in an agony of despair, she clutched fast hold of the railing that went round the gallery. Lothair heard the madman raging and Clara's scream of terror. A fearful presentiment flashed across his mind. He ran up the steps. The door of the second flight was locked. Clara's scream for help rang out more loudly. Mad with rage and fear, he threw himself against the door, which at length gave way. Clara's cries were growing fainter and fainter. "Help! Save me! Save me!" And her voice died away in the air. "She's killed, murdered by that madman," shouted Lothair. The door to the gallery was also locked. Despair gave him the strength of a giant. He burst the door off its hinges. Good God! There was Clara in the grasp of the madman Nathaniel, hanging over the gallery in the air. She only held to the iron bar with one hand. Quick as lightning, Lothair seized his sister and pulled her back, at the same time dealing the madman a blow in the face with his doubled fist, which sent him reeling backwards, forcing him to let go his victim. Lothair ran down with his insensible sister in his arms. She was saved. But Nathaniel ran round and round the gallery, leaping up in the air and shouting, "Spin off, firewheel! Spin round, firewheel!" The people heard the wild shouting, and the crowd began to gather. In the midst of them towered the advocate Coppelius, like a giant. He had only just arrived in the town and had gone straight to the marketplace. Some were going up to overpower and take charge of the madman, but Coppelius laughed and said, "Ha ha, wait a bit, he'll come down of his own accord," and he stood gazing upwards along with the rest. All at once, Nathaniel stopped as if spellbound. He bent down over the railing and perceived Coppelius. With a piercing scream, "Ha, fine eyes, fine eyes," he leapt over. When Nathaniel lay on the stone pavement with a broken head, Coppelius had disappeared in the crush and confusion. Several years afterwards, it was reported that outside the door of a pretty country house in a remote district, Clara had been seen sitting hand in hand with a pleasant gentleman, whilst two bright boys were playing at her feet. From this, it may be concluded that she eventually found that quiet domestic happiness which her cheerful, blithesome character required, and which Nathaniel, with his tempest-tossed soul, could never have been able to give her. The end. This has been The Sandman by E.T.A. Hoffmann, narrated by Sam Kusi.